16. Driving wheels under a single boiler. A tender riding on 14 more. Steel enough to cross a city block and keep going. It was 132 feet and 9 inches long, which meant that at the end of every run, there were exactly 4 places on the entire Union Pacific that could turn it around. Cheyenne, Laramie, Green River, Ogden. Every other turntable on the railroad was too short, and a locomotive that cannot be turned is a locomotive that can only ever work one road. Otto Jabelmann spent 3 months designing it to pull 3,600 tons over a mountain range without help. It did that perfectly for 18 years. Then they cut up 17 of them. Have you ever watched a company pour money into something that worked exactly as promised and then walk away from it anyway? Put it in the comments. This is what American Iron Works takes apart. Subscribe so you catch the next one. The problem was never the locomotive. The problem was a mountain range in Utah. East of Ogden, the Wasatch climbs at a ruling grade of 1.14%. That number sounds small. On a railroad that runs nearly flat for 1,000 miles out of Omaha, it is a wall. Union Pacific had been fighting that wall since 1869. The answer, for 70 years, was more locomotives. 2 engines on the front, helpers cut in behind, crews called out, paid, and sent home again at the far end. It worked. That is the part that gets skipped. The railroad was not failing, it was spending. Every helper meant another crew on the payroll, another boiler to inspect, another set of couplings made and broken on a grade while the train stood still. The mountain did not stop Union Pacific. It taxed it every single day on the busiest freight corridor the company owned. And in 1940, that corridor was about to get busier than anyone had planned for, because the country was 3 years into rearming and the traffic between Ogden and Green River was climbing. The man who decided to stop paying that tax was William Jeffers. Jeffers had started as a janitor for Union Pacific at 14 after leaving school over a fistfight with a teacher. He never worked for another railroad in his life. He became its president. He gave the job to Otto Jabelmann, vice president of research and mechanical standards, and the order was not complicated. Build something that takes 3,600 tons over the Wasatch alone. Jabelmann had come up the same way. He started as a laborer in the Cheyenne engine facilities, then crew caller, machinist apprentice, roundhouse foreman, superintendent of shops. He studied engineering at Stanford in Michigan on the way through. The buildings he had swept out as a young man became the buildings that housed the locomotives he designed. His department had 3 months. That is the whole design window. 3 months to settle the wheel arrangement, the boiler, the firebox, and the frame on a machine nobody had built before. Union Pacific had been collecting test data on its own locomotives for years, and that stack of paper is the only reason the number was 3 and not 30. From the order to the first finished locomotive took about a year. 6 months to design and gather parts, 6 months to build. Here is what came out of it, and every one of these numbers is on the record. 25 locomotives built by the American Locomotive Company at Schenectady, New York. 20 in 1941, 5 more in 1944. The first 20 cost $265,174 apiece. The final 5 cost $319,600. Each one measured 132 feet, 9 7/8 inches over engine and tender, 16 feet, 2.5 inches tall, 11 feet wide, with the ladders and handholds recessed into the body to keep it that way. The clearance was tight enough that the whistle was mounted lying on its side, so it would not add an inch to the height. Loaded, the first class weighed 1,189,500 pounds. The second class weighed 1,208,750. 2 men ran it, an engineer on the right side of the cab, a fireman on the left, and better than 1,000,000 pounds of moving iron answering to the pair of them. 300 pounds of steam pressure, 4 cylinders, 23 3/4 inches across, with a 32-inch stroke. A starting tractive effort of 135,375 pounds. Filled for service, the boiler alone held 10,500 gallons of water, which comes to 87,150 pounds, or 43.5 tons of water riding directly above an open fire. The first one reached Omaha on the 4th of September, 1941. But Jeffers had not handed Jabelmann a single number to hit, and this is where the story of the machine stops being a story about engineering. He gave him 2 numbers. Almost nobody quotes the second one. The famous number is the tractive effort, 135,000 pounds of pull. The second number is an adhesion factor of 4. Adhesion factor is the ratio between the weight on the driving wheels and the force those wheels are asked to produce. Ask a locomotive to pull harder than the weight holding it down and the drivers spin. Steel on steel has no grip to spare. So demand a factor of 4 and the arithmetic writes itself. 135,000 pounds of pull requires roughly 540,000 pounds pressing down on the drivers. That is not a design choice. It is division. And that is the number that should be famous, because it is the one that started the spending. 540,000 pounds on 16 driving wheels works out to 67,500 pounds on every single axle. Each axle pressed down with about the weight of a fully loaded semi-truck. There were 8 of them under the boiler. Ordinary track could not take it. So before a single locomotive turned a wheel, Union Pacific laid 130-pound rail from Ogden up to the Wasatch summit and rebuilt the bridges underneath it. That was the first bill. The length wrote a second one. At 132 feet, the machine could not be turned on any existing turntable, and it could not hold a tight curve. So the railroad installed new 135-foot turntables at its servicing points and realigned curves to clear a minimum radius of 288 feet. Neither of those bills was for locomotives. Union Pacific spent $265,174 apiece on 25 machines and then spent again, twice over, on a stretch of track. And that corridor only paid back for as long as that corridor stayed steam. Nobody in 1941 drew that line. There was no reason to. That one requirement quietly decided the ending, 20 years before anyone reached it. Which part of that lands harder for you? That they missed it, or that there was nothing to miss? The machine that came out of it was, by every measure that mattered to a railroad, correct. Jabelmann had not started from nothing. He took the 4664 Challenger already on the roster and rebuilt it. He enlarged the firebox to 235 inches by 96. He lengthened the boiler. He added 4 driving wheels and dropped the driver diameter from 69 inches to 68. The 4-8-8-4 wheel arrangement was not a stroke of inspiration. It was what fell out of the arithmetic once the 2 numbers were fixed. There was still the question of how a machine that long gets around a curve at all. The answer was articulation. The front set of 8 drivers rides on its own frame, hinged to the rear engine so the leading half can swing while the boiler above it stays straight. American Locomotive described the suspension that made it work as lever control, a 3-point arrangement that stopped the wheelbase from binding on a bend or lifting a wheel clear of the rail. 16 driving wheels, and none of them fighting each other. And then it went to work. The firebox burned at around 2,000 degrees. Coal reached it through a mechanical stoker rated at better than 12.5 short tons an hour because no fireman alive could shovel at that rate. Roughly a ton of coal into the fire every 5 minutes, hour after hour, with nobody lifting anything. Inside the boiler ran enough tubing to stretch more than a mile if you laid it end to end. On the 3rd of April, 1943, Union Pacific put a dynamometer car behind one of them on the Wasatch grade and wrote down what happened. Engine 4016. Ogden to Evanston, Wyoming. 76 miles, climbing about 2,500 feet. 71 cars behind the drawbar, weighing 3,883 tons. 3 hours and 50 minutes. It burned 996 pounds of coal and 464 gallons of water for every mile of that. Fuel economy on this machine was measured in gallons to the mile, not miles to the gallon. Management had a name picked out for the class. They were going to be the Wasatch type. Then an unnamed workman at the Schenectady plant chalked 2 words on the smokebox front of the first one. Someone took a photograph, and the name stuck. Big Boy. The man who wrote the name that outlived the machine is not recorded anywhere. Neither, in the end, was much of a farewell for the man who designed it. In the autumn of 1942, Union Pacific sent Jabelmann to Europe on a wartime consulting trip. On the 6th of January 1943, a heart attack killed him while he was standing in a London railway station. He had been in the job 4 years. The heaviest working years of the class, 1944 through 1947, happened without him. He never saw a Big Boy do what it had been built to do at full stretch. He also never saw the arithmetic close. Turning a locomotive is not optional. At the end of a run, it has to face the other way, and to do that, it needs a turntable at least as long as it is. Union Pacific had 4: Cheyenne, Laramie, Green River, Ogden. That was the whole list. So the most powerful steam locomotives in America were, permanently, Wasatch engines. 25 machines that could pull anything in one place. There was no fix for that, because there was no mistake. Shorten the boiler, and you cut the heating surface. And a smaller heating surface cannot raise steam fast enough to feed 4 cylinders, which drops the tractive effort straight back below the number that justified the whole program. The length was the power. They are one property wearing 2 names, and you cannot keep half of it. I do not think this was an error, and that is what makes it hard to look at. Then the world moved, and it moved the same way twice. In 1948, Union Pacific and General Electric tested a gas turbine prototype. 10 production turbines followed in 1952 at $540,000 each. 30 more came after them at 8,500 horsepower, the largest locomotives ever built, so loud that most California cities outlawed them. Crews called them Big Blows. They were gone by 1970. The railroad reached for one enormous machine twice, and twice built something too large to put anywhere. The turbines are the part I cannot get past. Union Pacific had just watched 25 locomotives get stranded by their own dimensions, and its answer was to order 30 more that were bigger. Whatever lesson was sitting there in 1959, nobody in Omaha picked it up. But the turbines are not an epilogue. They are the corridor being converted out from under the big boys, while the big boys were still working perfectly. The last revenue train, hauled by one, ended its run early in the morning on the 21st of July, 1959. Most were kept stored and serviceable until 1961, and 4 were still in working condition at Green River as late as September of 1962. Nothing was broken when they stopped. 17 of the 25 went to the torch. 8 survive. Every one of the first 20 passed 1,000,000 miles first. Number 4014 finished with 1,031,205 of them. The highest total in the class belonged to 4006 at 1,064,625. In November of 1958, months from the last run, Trains magazine counted 521 newspaper mentions of the Big Boy across 45 states. The fame peaked as the function hit 0. Number 4014 draws crowds today that it never drew on a single working day of its life. Otto Jabelmann solved the problem he was handed in 3 months, and his solution was correct, and the correctness is what finished it. He died in a railway station 18 years before the last one stopped, and he never knew the bill had already been paid in 1941. Look for that shape, and it turns up everywhere. The constraint that makes a machine capable is the same constraint deciding where it can never go, and the invoice arrives long before anyone thinks to read it. American Iron Works pulls that apart, one machine at a time. Subscribe, and the next one is already on the bench.